A few months ago, if you had asked anyone in information security to cite an example of an effective critical infrastructure hack by a remote criminal hacker, they might have mentioned the attack on the water treatment plant in Oldsmar, Florida. This happened days before the Super Bowl and got a lot of attention. Here's the CBS Morning News.
A hacking attack on a water treatment plant is raising big questions about the vulnerability of critical facilities nationwide. Federal investigators are searching for a hacker who tried to poison the Oldsmar, Florida water system on Friday, just 15 miles from the Super Bowl, right before the big game. Officials say the intruder broke into the water treatment controls for about 5 minutes. As Jeff Pegues reports, the intent was to add too much of a dangerous chemical.
This is obviously a significant and potentially dangerous increase.
Pinellas County Sheriff Bob Galtieri says a water treatment plant operator first noticed the remote access hack. The bad actor increased the amount of sodium hydroxide or lye in the water supply from 100 parts per million to more than 11,000.
The public was never in danger. It would have taken between 24 and 36 hours for that water to hit the water supply system.
For the 15,000 residents of Oldsmar, Florida, the increase of sodium hydroxide in the water supply could have caused vomiting, chest, and abdominal pain.
This type of activity and this type of hacking of critical infrastructure is not necessarily limited to just water supply systems. It can be anything.
It's a scary scenario. However, the final FBI report, which only recently came out, found that it was an employee that was responsible for the elevated levels of sodium hydroxide in the water. And as we heard in the previous episode of Error Code, attacks on the power grid are also few and far between. But that doesn't mean that threats don't exist. They do. This, then, is a story about researchers who are monitoring the threats against IoT and OT systems and the steps that are being taken to mitigate them. I'm Robert Vamosi. This is Error Code.
My name is Ishmael Valenzuela, and I'm the Vice President of the Threat Research and Intelligence Team at BlackBerry.
BlackBerry as a company is no longer making mobile phones. They've pivoted to become a cybersecurity company with a strong IoT division. So why is it that people still don't know that?
You know, that's a very good question. And I have to say that a lot of people would say the same thing, right? Oh, we love the phones. And I was one of those fans that had lots of BlackBerrys over the years, and that I still miss them too. But BlackBerry is no longer in these in the phone market or industry. We are a cybersecurity and IoT company, and that's, when you think about it, it's we're at the intersection of that, which is fascinating, right? We're not just protecting a phone; we're protecting all the devices that we're using and that we'll be using in the future.
This conversation will be focusing around threats against IoT and OT systems, some of them used in critical infrastructure.
Yes, so we are part of the cybersecurity unit, and within the threat research and intelligence team, well, we do exactly that, like researching the threats, monitoring what's happening out there in the world, and trying to understand what those threats mean to different organizations in different locations, different industries. And more importantly, trying to translate that into what we call actionable countermeasures, or in a less maybe technical way, just a defensive strategy.
Ishmael is the principal author of the BlackBerry Cybersecurity Global Threat Intelligence Report. And yeah, almost every company issues a threat report these days. But as we stated earlier, BlackBerry is now an IoT and OT security company. Within the report, there was mention that macOS is not necessarily safer than Windows OS. The idea that there's no malware on macOS devices, well, this is a myth. This is a marketing myth that came out of Apple. The report found, for example, that Doc2 Master is the most seen threat on macOS. According to the report, Doc2 Master surreptitiously injects ads directly into web pages and collects user and system data to sell back to the underground market. BlackBerry researchers noted a whopping 34% of the client organizations using macOS actually had Doc2 Master on their network, and it was found in 26% of their devices. I recorded this interview a few weeks before the annual RSAC conference in San Francisco.
I will be at RSA together with Dmitry Vestushev, who is our senior director for the threat intelligence team at BlackBerry. And we're going to be doing a talk on macOS threats. So we'll be talking about the threats that we see coming from nation states, or the APTs, and also threats from more like common cyber crimeware. What we say in the report is that there is no safe platform, right? Now, safe or not, we would have to look at data. And what the data says is that there's less attacks on macOS in comparison to Windows, or even in comparison to Linux, which is getting a lot more attacks, especially because we use it a lot in cloud and OT environments or IT devices. So yes, in general, you could say there is less attacks against macOS, but does it mean that it's a safer platform? Well, what it means is that there is less footprint in corporate environments.
Okay, so this is interesting. So macOS isn't necessarily safer. It's just not present in many corporate environments.
Here's something that attackers know. Typically, when I target I sent a phishing campaign, right? Somebody clicks on something, downloads a Trojanized software, and you infect one machine. Typically, the data you're looking for is not in that system, right? You need to do some discovery, find out who's got the keys to the kingdom, who's got the crown jewels, where the data that I need, that I want to exfiltrate is. That means pivoting, right? Where we say lateral movement or pivoting. Pivoting off a Mac OS device is a lot harder because these are systems that are designed to use by a professional, right? Somebody that is working on a project, developers, graphical designers, but they're not necessarily designed as Windows to work in a corporate environment where there is easy communications. That's why attackers are just focusing on Windows, because it's easier to pivot and go to the servers, the file servers, the systems that has the data that attackers are interested in. However, having said that, we see more and more Mac malware.
To continue with macOS, the report also noted that BlackBerry has seen an increased use of Golang to target macOS systems as part of a wider cross-platform attack against multiple systems for opportunist attacks. To operate efficiently on multiple platforms, these attacks rely on simple functions that exist across all the platforms.
In reality, what we see is not that sophisticated or complex. It's mostly spyware, adware. We talk in the report about proxy malware. So malware that will proxy communications, so it will set up as a local proxy in your machine. So when you're connecting to a website, it's decrypting the data, right? And looking at those secrets. Could be usernames, passwords, cookies, anything that can be used by the attacker to steal that data. So essentially, info stealers, what we call info stealers, right? They are trying to capture credentials to use them to steal more data.
What I want to focus on is the IoT and OT threats.
We are obviously in a lot of OT environments, and that could be, ranging from medical devices to, military equipment, to a lot of other industries that make, use of systems that communicate with each other. And as I, guess we're going to get into some of that. When you think about it, everything is designed to be connected in some way. So we cannot just focus on one or two use cases. If we really want to ensure that security is embedded into everything we do, we need to look at not just devices, but more importantly, the data. I think that's where the focus should be.
So attacks going after environments is interesting. It seems to not matter what the devices are that are there. It's the overall environment. This type of reframing is important, I think.
One of the things I like to highlight, since we're talking about vulnerabilities, threats, I think this field has been very focused on vulnerability, patching, right? And unfortunately, it's something we still have to do, right? It's the boring piece. Attackers, they still leverage vulnerabilities that haven't been patched. We see this on a daily basis. But it's not enough, right? Sometimes we call this cyber hygiene or best practices. That's like the bare minimum, but it's not enough. And what that means is that security leaders, those who are listening to us, they should think about how to effectively manage risk.
I don't know why, but I always have to step back and think about risk as a separate thing. In security, it means that we identify, assess, and implement security controls in our systems and applications to stop threats. Well, how do we do that? We look at the threat landscape, and we identify what are the likely threats, and then arrive at what are our risks and plan accordingly. Even then, it's a ballpark estimate. Actual mileage will vary.
We cannot address every single risk. We cannot eliminate threats. It's the same thing as in the physical world, right? You walk out of the street, out of your house every morning, you get in the car or you go for a walk, and we do this intuitively without thinking too much about it. But in the back of our head, we're always thinking, right, about the weather or about any other event that could create, harm to us or to our families. And we're making decisions based on that. It may not be perfect, but we always try to mitigate, that risk.
Again, risk is a fascinating subtopic because almost everyone has a different level of risk. For some, it's innate, born out of evolution. We have this sixth sense that we know not to go in that dark cave or down that dark alley. And for some, it's born out of personal experience. I had a bad time in Cancun. Therefore, I don't risk going back to Cancun.
Same thing. Organizations cannot just say, you know what? I have a firewall, I have an antivirus, I have this, I have that, I have a training program, I am good. How do you know? Do you know what are the threats that are applicable to your organization, in your region, in your industry? If you're in Latin America, you're conducting business in Ecuador or in Mexico, you're subject to very different type of threats than if you are conducting business in Southeast Asia, or if you are, a hospital in the US or a government agency in Europe. Completely different. Yes, there are macro things that we see all over the world, but each region and each industry have their own threats. So I think that security leaders, business leaders, they need to start thinking about how this affects operations, because at the end of the day, as this, I hate to say this threat landscape because it sounds like a cliche, right? But but that's what it's happening. As the world is getting more complex, businesses will have to make decisions based on these to survive.
Operational technology, OT, these are devices that may not be connected to the internet. They're the conveyor belts, the elevators, the mechanical operations that are necessary, say, in a manufacturing environment. Bad actors can get at you from the inside.
There are internal and external threats that are present all the time. It could be somebody that's already working in that organization that may want to cause damage. They may want to, get patient data. It could be somebody that, I was having this conversation with a colleague recently, went to the doctor's office and, they're doing some tests and they walk out of the room. There's a computer there. It's unlocked. And I can insert the USB drive. Actually, we talk about that in the next report. We still see this type of physical attacks, right? Non-sophisticated, just a USB drive, inserting that. So at the end of the day, what attackers are going is anything that can give them some advantage. And this could be going after, systems to hold them hostage and the typical ransomware attack, or it could be what we see as a new trend in cyber criminals, just exfiltrating all the data that may have value to an organization. In case of healthcare, patient data is definitely the gold there, and then selling this data in the dark web, or demanding a ransom in exchange of sending that data back to you.
If you just put everything behind a firewall, you're good, right? No.
In some cases, in most cases, these devices are not exposed to the internet directly. So they're going to be behind some sort of a perimeter. But, we think about attackers as the espionage, the threat actors in, the nation states, the so-called APTs, people that is outside of the network. And we have to start thinking that attackers that are inside of the network of these organizations. So a lot of the traditional design has relied on, this is safe, it's behind the firewall, do not encrypt the communications. or this has default credentials. Yeah, who cares? It's behind the firewall. It's safe.
So, I was curious to see how the Cybersecurity Global Threat Intelligence Report was different from other reports. One thing I noticed, it only covers about 90 days worth of data, from September to the end of November 2022. I also noticed the lack of naming of groups behind the malware.
Yes, we're trying to be careful with not calling out a specific, who's the specific government or the specific actor behind something. So as you know, we all the threat intelligence groups, threat research groups, we just give these names. We have obviously, some suspicions of who is behind this based on our knowledge of the space.
Often, with state actors, we're limited to thinking about the usual suspects: China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. But there are other equally powerful state actors in the world.
But what we see, for example, Latin America, this is what you're referring to, espionage against specific people, specific high-value targets. It's something we see all over the world. Targeting a specific diplomat that is traveling, that's going to a conference, targeting a politician that is, that has a specific agenda. This is what governments have done since, forever, right? I'm thinking back in the Cold War, it was done with, radios and microwaves, like spying on each other. Today is done through, in the underground of the internet. But that's where we see a lot of the, not just endpoint malware, traditional malware, but also espionage kits, rootkits, things like the Pegasus that we have seen across many different governments. Sometimes it's interesting. We see in one country, within a particular government, we see 3, 4, 5 different groups. And sometimes they're not from outside the country. Sometimes these are like, political parties, other people that they just have some interest, spying on journalists, spying on politicians, and they're all within the same country and they're spying on each other. And this gets reflected in the cyber world.
In information security, I feel that South America doesn't get mentioned as much as it should. Brazil has a very active group of hackers, both legit and criminal.
Yes, and actually it's one of our areas of interest. We have researchers that live in the region as well, because you have to do it that way, right? It's not just about reading the news and understanding what's going on in the country, but also having the people that understand the culture, that live there on a daily basis. And they are not just really skilled threat researchers from a technical perspective, but also we call them, intelligence analysts, because they can translate the geopolitical situation into a cyber threat and what it means. So yes, we see Brazil has always been a very active country in terms of cyber criminal activity. But we also we did a report recently that we presented at a security conference in Spain, talking about the link between all of these different attacks in Latin America, and we see a lot of activity related to again the geopolitics. Dissidents, journalists are being targeted. Specific people in the governments that are they get these espionage kits on their phones to look at communications. We see the support of other countries outside of Latin America, like sometimes North Korea, Russia, Iran. We also see how some actors are getting paid to create like fake profiles to generate some type of opinion in social media, this type of manipulation, right? So it's not just all about espionage, and it's also about manipulation of the information.
And this activity in Latin America, it extends to other parts of the world as well.
We live in a very connected world, which at the same time is super fragmented. It's getting more fragmented than ever, right? With all of these political tensions between the East and the West. But yeah, we know that obviously the United States have a vested interest in Latin America, and so have other countries as well. So we see this reflected in these type of attacks, and if you follow the news, whenever there's been like some type of a revolt, like in Venezuela or in Ecuador, this gets reflected in the in the cyber world, in the form of attacks or in the form of, as I said before, manipulation of information.
So the types of attacks that we're seeing are as varied as the motivations.
And I think this is important because I see a lot of people out there thinking, well, threat intelligence, this is, we call it IOCs, indicators of compromise, IPs, hashes, domains. No, that's the lowest level of that. Threat intelligence is knowing that, look, if you are a business that is conducting operations or business in Southeast Asia, in Taiwan, for example, you need to know what's happening right now because there's a lot of interesting things happening. A lot of different countries, governments trying to do espionage in this region. Actually, a few weeks ago, we found out a specific piece of malware. It was a Trojan that we saw in a Taiwanese manufacturing plant that had geofencing. So what this means is that this malware would only communicate if it was in a specific region, specific place, and it was designed to steal, information out of this organization. Okay, there's somebody that has a clear motivation on that. So if you're in the manufacturing business, you need to know about these things because that data can end up being in the hands of your competitor. Or you may, find that a government is using this information for, some type of thing or reason that could impact your business at the end of the day.
So within the report, I also saw that there's 62 new malicious samples being seen per hour. That's roughly one a minute. To put that into some context, I'm curious whether Ishmael is seeing more malware threats this year than last year. I mean, is the trend going up? Should we be worried?
Well, I will give you, statistics and numbers. Sometimes it can be deceiving, right? It can be interpreted in many different ways. We see a lot more automation being used by attackers. And in the same way that, and I don't know, in your program, you've talked about ChatGPT before, right? So without having to go down that rabbit hole, but it's obvious that attackers, as I usually say, attackers are lazy in the same way that we are. If I can get my work, my task done in less time, why wouldn't I do that, right? Using the tools that I have. So yes, attackers are doing this for that reason. It takes less time. And also because there's still many organizations out there, they defend based on, a hash or a fingerprint of a particular malware. Oh, I've seen X, therefore I will block X. That doesn't work anymore. And attackers know this, and that's why they generate so many samples. But to give you a sneak peek or preview of what we'll be publishing in our next report, we see definitely an increase. In quarter over quarter, we have seen an increase of sometimes up to 12 times the number of new distinct samples that we see targeting customers on a daily basis. What we do from our threat intelligence, threat research side is, as I told you before, like monitoring what's happening. And then a lot of that intelligence gets built into the products. So all of these products benefit from the research that we do. So, for example, we use AI-driven products, and that allows us to, block, preemptively anticipate what attackers are doing. That's the best definition of intelligence, really.
This is an interesting statement. At RSAC this year, companies were falling over themselves to announce AI for their cybersecurity systems. In many cases, it's just glorified machine learning. It's marketing-led AI. There's no clear definition of what we mean when we say artificial intelligence in cybersecurity.
It's the art of taking the adversary by surprise, or as a defender, not being taken by surprise by the attacker. So that's what we try to do with our AI technology. So if there's a new malware sample that we haven't even seen yet, it's something new. We have those machine learning models that have been trained in a way that, okay, we know that this is malicious based on anomalous behavior. We're going to block it. Then we have services on top of that. So, for example, managed detection and response, or managed extended detection and response. The idea is that you can never take the human element out of the equation.
So the human is still there, making decisions. But what I'm hearing is that there is some benefit to using AI.
Yes, AI is great We have obviously, and we're going to see a lot more advancements in the application of AI to cybersecurity. But there's always something that humans have, and it is not only creativity, but also the ability to understand context. What does this mean to my organization today, right? We're going through, the publication of our quarterly results. We are, in the middle of working with this important project with the government. My CFO is visiting, this country, and that's why we see this. That context, yes, it can be eventually, provided by machines, but a human needs to make a decision based on that. And sometimes that decision affects the life of other people. And, that's why I always say I may want to drive an autonomous car, but if I run into an accident, hopefully not, I want to be assisted by a human, maybe assisted by a drone or something like that too, right? But I like to think about humans being augmented by AI and humans, feeding that loop. But there has to be a human in the loop.
So if you have AI services and they flag a problem, how do you mitigate a vulnerable OT system? How do you protect it from an attack when there's no internet connectivity to the device in the field?
Well, that's where the human element is so important. And I think we definitely have a lot of technology today, but just the most basic form of instant response, which is like having a short list of people with phone numbers to call, right? Say, hey, look at this. That still works. And many organizations actually have found that obviously since the pandemic with COVID, a lot more remote work has been happening, like people working from home and all of this. Some of this instant response that was very well rehearsed, or let's say, more effectively managed when people were in the office, now it's a bit more difficult because people cannot get hold of people. And yes, we use email, but what if, there is no internet? What if your system has been ransomed and you cannot use it? You have to have that, a backup. And sometimes traditional mechanisms are still effective when it comes to doing instant response.
Another difference with OT is right there. Devices out in the field without connectivity. Sometimes that means it's deep within an urban core, such as within a mass transit system.
I live here close to the city of New York. I've done a lot of work in the city of New York. For example, with my team was responsible for a lot of the security in the subway. And we're talking about places that have difficult physical access. So when you design cybersecurity defenses for this, you have to be very, very aware of that. What's the cost of going and replacing something, underground, when you have like hundreds of subway stations?
Another infrastructure that is vulnerable to attacks is healthcare. The diversity of devices within a healthcare organization is astounding. The BlackBerry report mentions that healthcare continues to be target of ugly ransomware situations. I mean, really, if your network is shut down because of ransomware and you have to postpone surgeries or turn patients in need of care away, that's bad.
I did a lot of work out of the city of New York as well, which is, critical infrastructure. When you have like 27 public hospitals across the city and there's a ransomware, right, or an incident like that, it could affect the systems that are providing critical care to patients, to humans that could, potentially die if you don't do something with that. That's a scary part about this. And, thankfully, I think that the people managing these environments are a lot more conscientious. Governments are also issuing directives and pushing the ball in the right direction. Obviously, there's still a lot to do.
In the United States, there's the Patch Act, which puts pressure back on the vendor to keep their medical devices up to date. And in the next episode of Error Code, I'll be talking with Josh Corman about that.
Yeah, no, it's, for example, if you look at an X-ray machine, typically what gets attacked is not the medical device itself with the embedded system, but typically what gets attacked is the system that controls that, which in many cases, it's an old version of Windows that hasn't been updated in the last 7 years. Because as you say, I cannot just go and say, oh, this is unpatched. This is Windows XP. Let me just upgrade it to Windows 11. No, because you have to change the whole thing. And in some cases, an X-ray machine could be worth what, $1 million or more. So that's not something that is easily going to happen. That's part of the challenge that we have in OT, manufacturing, and healthcare environments. That some of these devices are running very old operating systems that cannot be patched. So two things that I think are important there is, this whole philosophy of zero trust, implementing less implicit trust, thinking that the attacker is also in the environment, right? That there's no internal and external threats, that there are always threats around you. And also something that I think is becoming more popular now, doing product security testing, which I see now more and more organizations saying, you know what, we need to create our own product security testing team. If an attacker is on the network, what could be the vulnerabilities that they could exploit, or misconfigurations? It's not just about vulnerabilities, right? A misconfiguration, or is there any proprietary protocol between these medical devices, between these manufacturing devices that we see communicated on the network? Is this exposing sensitive data that could, expose something, or could give an attacker that's on the network further access?
Again, we have various devices that we're talking to within the healthcare system.
In the next report we'll be publishing, that we're reviewing right now, we're going to be continue talking about healthcare, for example, and we see a lot more attacks going after healthcare environments than financial environments, which it's very telling, right? Attackers are going after impact at the end of the day, and it also indicates that financial organizations, they typically have larger budgets. They have been working in cybersecurity for a long time, in building a solid defense. Doesn't mean they don't get impacted, but attackers also know that healthcare environments are a lot more unprotected, and industrial environments are another example of that. So in the next report, we actually talk about energy sector, manufacturing. So yes, we see a lot more attacks going after OT environments. Typically, they do not attack OT environments directly. They go after the IT environment, which is easier, and then from there jump into the OT environment, or any sort of IoT device that could be accessible from there.
The good news is that steps are being taken.
Well, so FDA is pushing now medical manufacturers to do this type of testing themselves, right, and create their own threat models, and ensure that once the product is out there in the hands of the hospitals, the clinicians, that this is secure. But I think that there's never enough testing, right? And I see more organizations, government agencies. I think hospitals down the line, I think they probably don't have maybe the resources to do that now, but they're thinking on doing these type of things, maybe with the help of third parties, and we get more inquiries about this type of services, which definitely brings a lot of value, because you're not just looking for vulnerabilities, you're also looking for ways in which a misconfiguration, sometimes the software we use could react in many different ways depending on what configuration you apply, and that can create an opportunity for an attacker to leverage that.
Often discussions around threats and risk are focused on what can go wrong. Well, it's important to think and plan, but it's also important to step back and recognize some of the progress we've made.
And the thing that is positive, I don't want to just talk about doom and gloom, but the thing that is positive is that we see a lot more collaboration between public and private organizations, between governments, sharing information, law enforcement. I mean, as a commercial organization, so much we can do, but we cannot go and, some people say, why don't you go and punch adversaries in the face? We would love to do that, but we can't. That's not our job. That's law enforcement job, right? And what we do is we collaborate with them to take over a command and control infrastructure, to expose, these criminals behind these mask, right? And that's been successful. We see a lot more indictments, prosecution, infrastructure being taken over, and I think that's the right the right way of doing this.
In the United States, the National Cybersecurity Strategy just came out with more emphasis on IoT and OT security. And I talk about this in Error Code episode 12. I'm wondering, though, if there are other countries that are doing similar strategies with OT, or if it's ever going to get to the point where it bubbles up to a consortium of countries that maybe band together in sort of a NATO of cybersecurity for IoT and OT.
The European Union recently issued some new directives. The government of Australia, same thing, Canada. These governments all over the world they're issuing these type of directives. But as I said earlier, we're never gonna get rid of this as long as there is an attacker that has a motivation, that has some intent. And in many cases, some of these attacks are also governments, as we know, right? They're behind this. But also cyber criminals, because there's money involved, because it's a business. As long as there is motivation, intent, and resources, there's always going to be some, cyber threats that could cause an impact to our organizations. However, yes, we want to protect citizens too, right? We want to protect critical infrastructure, our hospitals, our schools, and that requires that type of public-private collaboration. And across countries, we already share information with a lot of national security agencies, not just in the U.S., but across the world. We are collaborating in an investigation with law enforcement right now, sharing information with them, and they share information with us. This type of collaborations across countries, within the country, they're definitely helping to mitigate the impact.
The good news is, with all this sharing, there's the MITRE ATT&CK framework. What it does is it creates a common language for discussing tactics, techniques, and procedures, or TTPs. When ATT&CK first came out, it seemed like a great table exercise. I wondered if it's becoming baked in now.
Absolutely. I think at this point, everybody knows, right? Unless you've been living under a rock for the last few years, that what MITRE ATT&CK is. And I think it's a great contribution to the community because what it created is a common language. It's like the Wikipedia of attackers' behaviors. And that is super important because we can not advance in this world where there's so many different attackers are motivated, so many interests, so many different motivations for attacking an organization. We cannot make progress in this world without information sharing. And we cannot share information unless we have a common language. Right? Like right now we're talking English, but we can talk Spanish if you want. But if you don't know Spanish, it's going to be hard for you, right, to follow all my conversation. So that's what MITRE ATT&CK is doing, just creating that common language that vendors will use, but also customers can use to ask questions to advance in their program. And that's, for example, we see that reflected in the cyber world. The tactics, their behaviors also change.
I'm also wondering what type of feedback Ishmael gets with a report like this.
It's funny. The threat actors that we expose in our reports, they also read our reports. How do we know this? Because after we expose them, the activity stops for some time. It pauses. Now they're reading our report and saying, you know what? Oh, man, we made a mistake here. See, I told you should have done this. Right? Let's change it. And they may go silent for maybe a number of weeks or a number of months while they come up with a new weapon or a new way of doing something. And then, we see that activity again. So that's what we can do. That's our mission to help protect customers by, exposing these and making sure they have the defensive mechanisms to mitigate the risk.
I'd like to thank Ishmael Valenzuela for coming on the show and talking about BlackBerry's most recent cybersecurity threat intelligence report with the attention on IoT and OT systems. It's a brave new world out there in terms of risk and threats, and it's good to see that, for the moment, the good people, they're winning. Hey, if you're enjoying Error Code, tell a friend. I'm sure there are other people out there who like narrative information security podcasts. And I'd really like to hear from you. DM me at robertvamosi@infosec.exchange on Mastodon and tell me what you like and even what you don't. And coming up, I've got some great episodes talking about IoT, of course, and also a deep dive into the Patch Act and how it's affecting the medical device industry. I hope you'll subscribe so you don't miss out.